Welcome to Wayward Writers. We're so thankful today to have with us the amazing Susan Chang, who was an editor at HarperCollins and Tor for a lot of years and now has her own freelance business. Nikki, would you read her bio for us?
Absolutely. Susan was born in Seoul, South Korea, and immigrated to the US with her family when she was 5 years old. She attended Stuyvesant High School in New York City and graduated from Vassar College with a degree in medieval and Renaissance studies. Susan began her publishing career at HarperCollins Children's Books, where she worked for 9 years before moving on to shorter stints at Hyperion Books for Children, which is a former imprint of Disney Publishing Worldwide, and Parachute Publishing, a book packager. She was a senior editor at Tor Books, which is part of Macmillan, for 17 years before launching Susan Chang Editorial. She lives in Queens, the most diverse borough of New York City. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you, Nikki. Thanks for reading my bio.
Oh, thank
We're
you.
so excited to have Susan with us today. As an agent, I see this big variety in my submissions and notice this vast difference in how advanced writers are in their craft. And it really makes me wonder, Susan, you've worked in traditional publishing with the Big Five for most of your career. So do you see a difference between manuscripts that were submitted to you as a Big Five editor and the manuscripts that you work on now in your freelancing business?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's one of the things that I was most curious about when I started the business. I didn't know who my clients were going to be, but I have been at this for about 2 years. And it turns out that most of the clients who find me are shooting for traditional publishing as their first option. I think that in terms of the difference, you guys as agents do a huge job of really finding the cream of the crop to submit to editors. So I was not surprised to see that there was a huge range in the level of craft or market knowledge that my clients show in the manuscript. So I was a little bit worried about having to maybe do a lot of um, like so this is something that I really never did because I'm not a copy editor or a proofreader, but and I don't really offer a lot of line editing services now
Right.
because it is so
Yeah.
grueling.
Yes, it is.
So I was just afraid that for some of the authors who are at the beginning end of the craft that I would have to spend a lot of time line editing, which I don't actually have to do.
That's good
So
news.
that was great.
What are some of the common things that you work with for people when they come to you for editing services?
Okay, so I actually prepared for this by looking at all of my clients over the past 2 years. And so I have some stats about this.
Oh, interesting.
But yeah, so I'm just very much a numbers and analytical
Hmm.
person because I feel that having the information about your business, and I felt this way about data and publishing as well. You do your job better when you have this basic level of information. So in my first year of doing freelance editing, I had 30 clients. And this year, which is my second year, I had 31 clients. And about 42% were middle grade, 30% were YA, 30% adult. So that's the range of the clients that I seem to be attracting
Hmm.
by my presence and hopefully word of mouth.
What are some of the common, what are some of
Oh,
the things that you see that we as writers are coming to you? What is it you're seeing that we need to work on? Are there some common themes that you're seeing?
so when I look at a client's work for the first time, and if I know that they are trying to be traditionally published, it's pretty much the same sort of criteria that I looked at when I was looking for books that I could acquire.
Mhm.
The two most important things were the level of craft. Were they a great writer? Did I love the book? And whether the book is marketable. So those two things still apply in terms of the clients who find me. If they are looking to be self-published, then whatever that they do is, as long as it's the best version of what they're trying to do,
Yeah.
that's great. But if they are trying to be traditionally published, I have to really make sure that I'm honest with them as to the level of, is your craft to the level of um, excellence that would allow you to be chosen, because that's what
Yeah.
traditional publishing is. It's you have no control over it. Really,
Right.
your level of craft has to be at the highest level possible before you would even try to find an agent. Um, and of course, it's all subjective, but it also has to be marketable. And that's something that is also very subjective, but it's whether your work fits a very narrow sort of format for whether it's a genre or a picture book or YA. I was just working with a client who just had a really long fantasy novel that he was trying to make it appeal to all ages. And I said, okay, you could either, if you want to be traditionally published, you have to take this manuscript, and if you could either do it as a middle grade, but then it has to be this number of words, and you have to focus on this character, or if you want it to be YA, you have to then cut it to this number of words and focus on the teen characters.
Yeah.
And you could do it as an adult book, but then you have to then focus on the adult characters. That's something I think that some authors are aware of because they've been at it for a long time, and
Mhm.
they attend conferences and they're aware of the market. Some are completely unaware. And in terms of the craft, something that I did mention to Heather way back when we first started talking about this is that I find a lot of beginning authors are not understanding of when they're being too expository. So that, like, about 50% of my clients, that's their number one issue. And it's kind of interesting because some of them are very they're thinking back to the books that they loved when they were growing
Yeah.
up, when expository books, like big epic tomes, like in the 70s and
Yeah.
80s. So there were the days of the Dune and all of the science fiction that was very expository
Yeah.
or omniscient, or even things like Shogun, which is one of my favorites. It was historical,
Yeah.
and it was a book I was really proud of because I was like a teen, or I was 12, and I was like, it's over 1,000 pages. And that's not what the finances of publishing is going to allow for anymore. But it's also not the reader taste,
Mhm.
where those big epic tomes are going to be published, except
Mhm.
in very limited
Mhm.
markets.
Yeah, I think reader taste has changed a huge amount. Even just the length of chapters, I've noticed, is really decreasing and things like that. And sentence variation. You really have to vary sentence length or people get bored too easily with your writing. I think there's a lot of little things. Just the attention of the reader, the modern reader, it's different than it used to be.
Yeah. I think that probably the fact that we're all on our phones, there's been such a change in terms of human experience with the internet and social media and being on phones, and it's really fractured our attention. And when I think back to pre internet days and pre cell phone, the fact that I loved really delving into a long book, and now I have had to set a rule for myself. I can't be distracted or go look at YouTube in the middle of a chapter. I have to wait till the end of a chapter. Um, so I think that we are all, and I'm curious, just as a person who just loves science fiction, to know what kind of changes that this kind of technology has developed in our brains and how we're going to evolve and change. But in terms of fiction, I think that we all have much less attention span. So that'd
Yeah.
be one of the reasons why.
Yeah,
Yeah.
my husband enjoys sci-fi and fantasy, and I might be at the library and see something and think he'll like it, and I'll come home and it'll be cut thick, and he'll look at me and I'm like, you don't have to write a book report. There is no time that this has to be due by. But sometimes it can be a little overwhelming, and not that you don't want to enjoy all of those pages. But like you said, life has
Yeah.
kind of changed. When you're talking about sci-fi and how you love that, what genres are you interested in editing? If someone was looking for an editor, what genres are your sweet spot?
It's funny because when I started my business, I was being very strategic as to what is my value to the author who wants to be published, and how do I differentiate myself from all of the other excellent freelance editors out there. And so I thought that I should probably have a specific niche, which is books that I worked on through most of my career. So mostly I acquired middle grade and young adult. But I found for some reason that I have attracted a wide range of clients. And so I just this year edited my first adult memoir. And as I said, about 30% of my clients are adult authors. And I find that really exciting. And the thing is that if I don't feel like I would do a good job, or if I feel there's an editor who's better for you, I will totally tell you that. But when I took on this memoir, I was very upfront. I told my client, I've never done a memoir, but I feel like I could do a great job. And so he ended up hiring me. But so I love the fact that I can do anything I want, that there's no bosses telling me that I can't do something. I have total control. And as long as I am delivering what I promise to my client and value and help them, and I feel totally happy with what I'm doing.
Yeah, for sure.
So I edit everything except for picture books.
Very cool.
So, other than expository writing, are there other issues that you have seen commonly throughout the things that you've edited?
Yeah, it's funny because I've had a lot of clients who they read and loved all the same books that I did when I was 12 years old, and a lot of it was like science fiction or like Star Wars, like Star Trek. I'm much more of a Trekkie than a Star Wars person. So I have this certain demographic of clients who I think find me because of Tor, and they are writing a kind of science fiction of a certain time, which is the 70s and 80s and 90s. That's something that I have to, and I'm honest with them. I tell them that I know where you're coming from because I was also that reader, even though like, we're about the same age and I'm like Gen X. We have the same things that we fell in love with at that age, but you can't write those same books for the market if you are going to be traditionally published because they are dated. And I often have to tell authors who are working on especially like genre fiction that these tropes are very dated, and what I like to advise them is write the book that only you can write. You can use these tropes in some one way or another, but you have to make it your own, and you have to refresh them in some way. It can't be the same five characters that we saw in 70s science fiction.
So,
Yeah.
what are some of the things that you tell your authors to do to update it or to make it feel more modern to the current readers?
I try to talk to them and find out what it is that they are passionate about. Like, where is this story coming from? It's something within you that wants to tell this story. So, and what are the things that you're passionate about? And I will often pick up on things in the manuscript that feel more authentic or feel more unique. And I will try to encourage them to work, like to start there, start with what you're really passionate about, because stock characters they come from somewhere. And so, you have to look within yourself to find out why you love this character or how to make it your own because of your own experiences growing up, or however this character is coming to you. And I'm not a writer myself, so I don't really know how characters come to you. So what
You
would
don't
you
want to know, Susan.
I don't want to know.
I totally
Probably not.
When you're reading a book,
I totally
you
get
always assume I always assume the first novel is the story of that person.
That's interesting.
And I always read a lot more into, I think that if you have written a book, then It's every single character in there has some part of you. And even when I was like editing, a lot of things are conscious. So I remember just editing where I would be noting, oh, at the end of every chapter, the character goes to sleep, or they have to go to the bathroom, or
There's
you don't
always
really
their
even want
eyebrows
to.
or their eyes. There's always
Yeah,
something.
yeah. There's certain things that I'm just like, I don't want to be your psychiatrist, but I am thinking those things.
It's a 2-for-1.
Oh, that's funny.
Charge extra for the psychology part.
I try to do that in a subtle way under the surface, and I think that because I am trying to see what's in the book that you want to get out that maybe you haven't, whatever that is. And this is why I feel really close to a lot of my clients, because they are striving, they're trying to contribute to the world. And whatever way they do it, I want them to do it the way that they are connecting with other people. And we're all human under the surface. So there's always going to be something there that we can all connect to on a human level.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
Going back to keeping it fresh, I was thinking when we were talking about that, whether you're a beginning author or whether you have been writing for 30 years, I think keeping your passion in your writing and keeping it fresh and keeping those ideas fresh is hard. Sometimes I think, too, it even is more difficult for the writer who's been writing a long time and is on deadlines and they have to write a certain number of words by X date. And I think it can be really a hard thing. Maybe that's another episode we should have.
Yeah, I think
thing.
that's something that we often see in our favorite writers once they have a long running series that they get bored. And so you can tell that it's really hard if you're a successful writer writing a series to get out of that trap, because your publisher is going to want you to keep doing the same thing, whether you start something else under a pen name. I think that's probably why J.K. Rowling did her mystery novel. I think that it's definitely hard to keep things fresh. But again, I'm not a writer, but I feel like if you are feeling compelled to do this really difficult thing, there's a compulsion, or there's something there that makes you keep sitting down and facing the blank page, which to me is horrifying. I always had a hard time writing cover copy because I'm a perfectionist. And even when I sit down to write my manuscript assessments or developmental edit letters, I always have that feeling like, oh my God, what am I going to say? Yeah, it's hard. We've chosen a hard industry.
So if I wanted to be your client, what does it look like to have you as an editor? Do I contact you and say, I've got this novel and it's wonderful, but I need you to take a look at it? What happens then?
Yeah, so what usually happens is that somebody contacts me on my website, and I will respond to them in the next day or two. And first I'll send my rate sheet, because I charge a certain level of rate, and I have to be upfront about that.
Absolutely.
And so I send it to them and say, this is my rate sheet, and if you're interested, we can go on to the next step. Which is a complimentary preliminary consult call of about 30 minutes over Zoom. And I will offer to read the first 10 pages, or if they have a query letter and or a synopsis, whatever you want to send me. If you have those things prepared, I will definitely look at it, and then I'll prepare for the meeting. We'll set it up and we'll talk, and I'll answer all your questions. I will send you samples of the work this is what a manuscript assessment is. This is what a developmental edit is. So I like to have that preliminary call first, and I don't think I ever really proceed without it. I like to make sure that you're like a real person. And then we talk about the scheduling. And if you want to hire me after that, I will send you over my client agreement, and then it goes from there.
So you can go back and forth as many times until you get to the point that you feel like it's ready?
So whether it's a manuscript assessment or a developmental edit, which are the two more substantive services I offer, I basically will give you dates. You send me your manuscript ready to be edited by such and such a date, and then I'll tell you it's going to be like 3 or 4 weeks or whatever it is. And then I go away and I do the work and I send it by the due date, and then I have a post edit consult call. Usually it's an hour or so. That's the structure of what happens. But everything is however much you as the client want to have feedback. If you send me an email 3 years down the road, I'll always answer it. So I like to be generous and give as much as possible. And so the communication is always free. It's just that if I have to, like if they come back and they want me to read the next draft, then I might do something where I'm just reading the revised manuscript and I just charge an hourly thing, and you might want to sign up for another. I've had clients come back for subsequent rounds of editing.
It's good if you have repeat customers. You must be doing something right, huh?
Yeah, so I've had 17 repeat customers. So
that's great.
Out of curiosity,
That's
Susan,
awesome.
are those the repeat clients? Are they writing in the same format and or genre? I'm very curious about like how you dipped into adult books and what has that been like? And for those of us that write both, can you kind of just speak to that a little? What you've seen this year as you've been doing that?
Yeah, so with the repeat customers, they usually come back to me for another round on the same manuscript that they've been working on so far. And I have had one client who hired me immediately to do a middle grade, and then also a couple of months later, she hired me to do a YA. So there are a couple who have different sort of projects that I'm working with them on. And in terms of the adult clients, I think that I've always felt that as an editor, that I can really edit anything. I think that, and I always say that we children's book people are actually adult people. And so we read adult books. We've always read it. So it's not like I feel like I can do the same things on an adult book as I would do for a YA book. And it actually goes the other way. I think that's probably true for editors who have only edited adult books. I think it's a little harder because YA and middle grade and even younger chapter books, they're not genres, they're audiences.
Yeah,
so
right.
there are certain, not rules, but certain things that we've internalized about what a middle grade book should be, what the character arc should be. And so it's more of a specialized knowledge of the audience, of the age of your reader. That's really important. And then with adult book, we don't really break it down that way. It's much more genre focused.
Yeah.
And voice is so different too. The voice in middle grade, voice in YA. I feel like that's part of that set of skills is the voice.
Yeah, because you are an adult trying to write for I think chapter books are the hardest.
Yeah.
And it's just a very specific age and voice. And it's not that you should never talk down or you should never dumb things down at all. Like when you think about people, even picture book artists or picture book creators like William Steig and Sylvester and the Magic Pebble and Maurice Sendak, they never dumb things down.
Right.
And you have to respect your audience. And it's not like you have to use smaller vocabulary that's not whatever you think the vocabulary of a 5-year-old would be. You can do anything as long as that it just meets the need and it's rhythmic or like poetic or fun. You can use like really long words in picture books. Fun words.
Yes.
So can we dive back into craft a little bit? Because I have some more questions for you.
Sure.
So we talked a bit in the beginning about expository writing. I feel like that's one of the biggest problems. You can tell your author you're doing a lot of telling, and that's what I'm trying to tell them. You have all this expository writing in there. How can you as a writer, because I think even established writers, even good writers, they still do this. They have a lot of expository things. So how do we recognize that in our own writing?
Yeah. I think that it depends on the kind of book that you're writing, but let's say it's like commercial genre fiction. So the way that readers are experiencing books now that's a little bit different is that it's like a scene in a movie. So that's how I try to show the author like why something is overly expository. It's I try to tell them to think about it as a scene. And I always say, this comes from having edited a ton of Mary Kate and Ashley chapter books for about 18 months, is like, and it's one of the things that I learned when I worked at Parachute, which is the packager who
Mm-hmm.
was responsible for Goosebumps and churning out a ton of best-selling books. And I learned this from the very smart women who I worked with, which is number one is act it out, which means to put yourself into the scene as an actor for so many things. It's like, how would you as a person react to something? And also the sensory details. I feel like if you're telling too much, then you're at a really distant God level point of view and you're not in the scene.
Mm-hmm.
So it's often more dramatic sort of tool. What would you do in this situation? Also just like the staging, the physical staging. What are you doing? What are you seeing, smelling, tasting? And who are you talking to, and are they only telling you something because they want to info dump something, or are you having a conversation that is dramatic, that advances the story? And so
Right.
I try to tailor like how I'm presenting this information to each person. If I know that they are like more of an artistic bent or musical, I try to talk about, okay, so if you have like you're in an expository high level point of view, so it's like expressionist art, versus if you're like more in the scene, it's more it's super hyper realistic, so you can almost taste that apple that you've painted. It's like that
Right.
level of very fuzziness. If I'm reading a scene and it's all fuzzy, I don't care. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm
Yeah.
always repeating constantly concrete, specific, vivid,
Yeah.
sensory, using all five
Yeah.
senses. My clients will recognize that because that's what I'm always saying.
Vivid.
Like,
I
this
love
is
that word.
vague. What
Mm-hmm.
is the temperature like in this scene? How is that person feeling from inside
Yeah.
their body?
I think that's a great challenge for all of us to think about. I was trying to do the senses, but I was thinking about temperature and all that. That's great, Susan. So,
Yeah. And obviously it depends on what the purpose of the scene is, sort
do you,
of.
I
Mhm.
just, do you like, obviously we don't do omniscient anymore. Those are 1960s books. But do you find that first person or third person close works better for getting more of that detail in, or does it just depend on the author?
I want to say that I do think we can still do omniscient, but there is this
Mm-hmm.
sort of telescoping back and forth that we do.
Mm-hmm.
Like when you have omniscient and you want to get more into the experience of third person perspective. I think that when you're a writer and you are in command of the tools of point of view and distance and
Mm-hmm.
perspective, and you can do really great expository writing. It's just how you are using the tools, and I think that often it's really hard to, like, that's the level of craft that you should be building to, that you have all of these tools in your toolkit and you can do what needs to be
Yeah.
done for that story. In terms of, I think that the most flexible point of view is probably third person. If you're thinking about whether it's first person or third person, I've always felt that third person past, which is very
Mm-hmm.
traditional, is probably, unless you're really great at first person present, that people don't notice it. Like, why make things harder on yourself? Just in terms of
Yeah.
Western literature, um, third person um, past is
Mm-hmm.
traditional. I don't know. As authors, do you have certain ways of storytelling that feel more natural or unnatural to yourself?
Well, I was wondering the urgency. I'm thinking of
Mhm,
a mystery or ghost story or thriller or something.
mhm,
And I agree with you. Third pass just seems to be like the default, more natural. And I know sometimes
right.
I'm thinking when I'm writing that, to that audience, is the third person pass, are they going to get the same urgency of that moment as opposed
Mhm.
to first person present? So
Yeah. Yeah, I think it depends on the genre, but also you can change things up. People do different points of view. But yeah, I think that you have to really go into, like, when you're writing a novel, that is a big decision that you have to
Yeah.
make. And I know that I have suggested switching things up, and but you really don't want to do that after you've written the, maybe you do,
It's not.
maybe it's a
It's not fun.
process that you've written. Yeah, no, I'm sure it's not fun, but I think that's a huge decision that you have to make at the beginning. But you can do that if you're able to comfortably tell the story in all of those different modes,
Mhm.
those storytelling modes. And really, that's something you have to develop over time. It's not easy. And the whole thing about, like, when remember reading Bridget Jones's diary, and like there's that whole sort of, okay, this is literally happening at the
Yeah.
second, that kind of detail of
Mhm.
it. It's like, I think she gets away with it because it's funny, but then when you have all the imitators and they try to do that, it's so grating, it's so jarring. They're not doing it right.
Yeah.
And I feel that way about IA, that I used to, when I used to read submissions every Sunday, I would go to Barnes and Noble with the first 10 pages of 10 different submissions from agents. And of all of the YA, I would say 70% of them were first person present. And it would just
Yeah.
drive me insane because, first of all, that flattens that either they are bad at it and it's grating, or they all sound the same. It's literally, they sound like the same author, no matter how different the story was. And that's like why I'm just like, why are you doing this? It's not easy. It's not easy. But
Yeah.
immediacy of YA, the high emotions and all of that stuff is why people do that. But you
Mhm.
have to do it well, and you have to do it unobtrusively.
The only time that I've ever taken on a client who did first person present was when I didn't actually notice that it was first person present.
Exactly.
And then
Yes.
I looked
And
back on it and I was like, oh, I'll be like really line editing or focusing on it and I'll be like, this is first person present.
yeah,
And I
and
don't
you don't
like that it
notice it.
is. I
Yeah,
yeah,
you don't
but
notice it because it's good.
Yeah.
right. And so that's
And
okay, you
yeah,
know.
and that
But
was like Hunger Games for me. Like, I have to keep going back to realize,
yeah,
oh my God, she's doing first person present. But
right.
it's so different from 8 out of 10 authors who think that's the default, and it really shouldn't be the
Yeah.
default.
Yeah.
What are
Okay.
we, in a general perspective, what are we as writers not doing? What are we getting in our own way with that is getting our
I like
work
that
to the
question.
next level that is can be traditionally published, trade publishing? What can we do better?
This is somewhat risky, but if you're really good at your craft and you're a really great writer, I think you have to still be brave enough and committed enough to fight. And I know you all are doing this to get the book out there, even though it's not in the mode of the next TikTok sensation. It's try to do something that's authentic and true and not like a copycat,
Mhm.
not like, because there's always authors who they hit, they just are lucky that they have, and some authors do this repeatedly. They have this sensibility for their audience and they're huge and they're super successful. But then if you as the author, you don't want to write that, or I as the editor didn't want to acquire or edit those kinds of books, I still brought value to the houses that I acquired for by publishing books that needed to be in the world, but they were not the next whatever the most recent TikTok thing is.
Fourth one.
Or, you know what it is? It's just to keep the passion and the hope, and don't approach it out of a sense of cynicism, which is just the worst thing for me, especially coming from children's and young adult books. And I think that this is something that we all struggle with. It's because we want to succeed in the corporate world and we want our books to sell. And so, if you as an agent or me as an editor would acquire or work with an author who was writing something that you didn't really love, or you actively disliked, but you knew it was going to sell a million copies. It's like some people make that choice, and some authors make that choice that they see what's selling and they try to write that. And some people are good enough where they're going to be able to do that. But it's like, why waste the time that you have on this earth doing this out of a cynical purpose. And if you are talented enough to get published in a really challenging market and it's not something that you really love, that's something that only you could write, but you're almost like painting by number. Okay, I want to write the next romantasy, and therefore I'm going to put this in there and this in there and this in there. And you might be good enough that it works, but I don't know. That's the one thing that really bugs me.
So back to what you were saying at the beginning is really write the story that only we can write and put
Yes.
that on the page.
Yeah. And that's what makes a work powerful. And this is something that it's like, it works for marketing, but it also works for the craft. It's like it has to be universal. It has to be human enough to appeal to every human person who would read this book, but specific enough that it's not the same as every other book. And it's the same thing when you're talking about query letters or marketing. It's like, this is what comps are. Okay, you have to relate it to a universal thing, but you also have to make it specific. So why this book is like all of these other books that sold, but what makes it different and unique? So you have to kind of do all of those things, which is hard.
Yes.
It is hard.
It's a challenge.
Well, writing is a challenge.
Well, and it's interesting
Yeah.
because we all know how long the process can be, whether it's a picture book or a novel. And correct me if I'm wrong, ladies, but I find it challenging enough when I'm in love and passionate about my book that I'm writing, let alone just trying to make a quick buck. That seems very painful to take years of your life, which to be miserable.
I think maybe publishing isn't where you make a quick buck anyway.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
No, I'm not sure that's where.
Yeah, but a lot of people who are they think that it is. They don't really realize. But I know that people have written things that they weren't necessarily passionate about, or they manufactured a book. You know what I mean? And I think about a lot of examples with when I worked at a packager, we had to sit there and manufacture books that we thought were going to be hits.
Right.
That's the job of a packager.
Yeah.
You have to come up with an idea that is so irresistible that the publisher will actually buy it on spec. And so there's tons of books like that, but and that's fine. Some of it's fine. Some of it is really, again, I'm thinking of a particular case where an author decided to pivot to doing YA books by starting a packaging company, and he managed to have a lot of bestsellers, but it was to manufacture a product.
I think it's
Can
money
take
at
a
the
product and
expense
sell
of
it.
the art. It's the expense of the art, which I think those of us who are really passionate about the craft and about producing books that matter in the world, it's hard
but
to see
even
happen.
if it is a Goosebumps or a Mary-Kate and Ashley Olsen books, let me just tell you, those were the hardest books I ever had to edit because the women who owned the company, they cared. And it doesn't matter if this was book number 35 in Mary-Kate and Ashley Olsen's chapter book series. I was tortured over those books because it's like, it is a good product, but it has to, like, you're doing it for a 9-year-old girl, and the reader is... So you have to do it. You have to make it the best that it can be, and so you can do any kinds of books. But it's like, I think maybe I'm saying two different things here. But I'm saying don't denigrate those books. But if your intention is cynical, then that's where I.
No, I think I understand what you're saying. No, it's whatever project you're working on. Give it your whole heart, rather than just. Oh, this is just a project to get through. And so it can be Mary-Kate and Ashley or Boxcar Children or anything like that, and put your whole heart in it, and it's going to show in the product that you have. Yeah.
Don't do it in a sloppy way. Don't do it in a cynical way. And one of the things that I learned when I first started at Harper is I had this really great editorial mentor, and she just always said, if you hear that little voice saying that this is wrong or this needs to be fixed, you would have to literally stop the presses and fix it, because you're doing it for children and they deserve your best effort. So just because, and this would drive the production people crazy, because if it were in the last pass and it was wrong, we would have to fix it, because we can't put out a book that has a known error. And I really admire that, even though it used to drive people crazy.
A lot for us to think about and to live up to in our writing. So I like the challenge, Susan. Thanks.
Yes, thank you.
Definitely.
You're welcome.
Well, Susan, if someone wants to find you in the big wide world, where would they go?
So I have a website. It's susanchanganitorial.com.
Okay.
Wonderful. Wonderful. We were very grateful that you
Yes.
came on and talked to us, and I feel like I've learned and remembered things that I should.
I feel challenged to go out and love my next project. So thank you, Susan. I like that.
And
Good.
to not do
Thank
too much
you.
expository writing.
Yes,
That's right.
we all do.
Or do it if you're doing it on purpose for a specific reason.
Right. No epics. No epics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for
Yeah.
your time. You were a delight.
Thank you.
Of course.
We
Thank you.
appreciate you so much.
Yes, thanks